Chapter 18 of The Sea Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Stephen Warner. On Hampstead Heath. French telephoned for a relief to take over the shadowing of Pike during the afternoon, but by 6 o'clock he was back in Keppel Street with the intention of being, if possible, present at the rendezvous of his new suspects. "He's not shown up since," Sergeant Harvey explained. "No one called, but one person left the house, a girl of about 20. She returned in about 2 hours. "Tall, good-looking girl, fair hair and blue eyes?" French suggested. "I know her, the landlady's daughter. I saw her when I called. That'll do, Harvey. You can get away. I shall manage alone." It was a fine evening, but cold. The last glimmerings of daylight were disappearing from the sky, and outside the radius of the street lamps stars began to show. It looked as if there would be frost later. To keep a secret watch on a house in a city street is a feat requiring no little skill. Though French had reached the stage in which he left most of such work to his underlings, he was a past master of the art. Yet, as first 7, then 8, then 9 struck from the surrounding clocks, it required all his ingenuity to give the appearance of being detained on some ordinary and unimportant business. He strolled up and down, hiding in alleyways and behind projecting corners, and moving on at intervals from one such place of vantage to another. He had engaged a taxi in case his quarry should do the same, and for a good part of the time he employed the old device of sitting back in its deepest recesses while the driver gave a lengthy first aid to his refractory engine. At last, when he had become stiff with cold and was cursing mentally but steadily at the delay, Pike appeared and started off quickly towards Russell Square. French drew back into the entry in which he was taking cover and allowed him to pass. Then, having signed to his driver to keep him in sight, he followed the quarry as closely as he dared. Pike turned down Montague Street, walking by New Oxford Street and Charing Cross Road to Charing Cross Station. He seemed about to enter the station, but suddenly, glancing around, he turned to the right and dived down the steps to the Hampstead and Highgate tube. French had already settled up with his driver, and he followed without delay. Keeping close behind, French shouted his man to the platform and entered the next coach of the Hampstead train, which the other boarded. At each station he watched the alighting passengers, but it was not until Hampstead was reached that Pike appeared. 20 feet apart, the two men passed out into the street and up the hill towards the heath. At the wide space at the entrance of the heath, French fell further behind. Pike was now strolling easily along, as if out for a breath of air before bed. He passed in towards the left, near Jack Straw's castle, taking one of the side paths which led to the wilder areas. Here were fewer people, and French dropped back till he could just see the man's light fawn coat like a faint smudge against the dark background of the trees. Some 400 or 500 yards from the entrance, down in the hollow, there are a number of thick clumps of bushes. Round one of these Pike passed and instantly became invisible. French stopped in his turn and, tiptoeing to the nearer side of the clump, began stealthily to creep nearer. Though a certain amount of starlight showed in the open, among the bushes it was pitchy black. There was no wind, and in spite of the vast city surrounding the place, scarcely a sound broke the stillness. French crept on, stopping every few seconds to listen intently. Presently he heard movements close by. There were faint footsteps as if of a man pacing up and down, and occasional soft scraping of leaves and snapping of small twigs. Crawling under a bush, French crouched down and waited. For close on 15 minutes, the man paced backwards and forwards, while French grew stiff in his cramped position. Then light footsteps were heard on the path alongside the clump, and a woman cleared her throat. The man moved out and said something in a low voice, to which the other replied. Then French heard Pike say, "Come behind the shrubs. There is no one about, and we shan't be heard." They moved close to French, though not so near as he would have liked. Listening intently, he could hear a good deal, though not all, of their conversation. The woman was Mrs. Berlin, and she was saying, "He suspects something, I'm sure of it. I've been just sick with terror all day. I thought I must see you, and this seemed the only way. I was afraid he might follow me if I met you publicly." There was a murmur of Pike's voice, but French could not distinguish the words, nor could he hear Mrs. Berlin's reply. Then he heard Pike say, "I don't think so. The note was there on the chimney-piece, but I'm quite certain it hadn't been opened. I examined it carefully." Mrs. Berlin's intonation sounded like a question. "Yes, I rang up Ganope, and he said that no inquiries had been made," Pike rejoined. "It's all right, Phyllis, I'm sure. Why, French explained that he had frightened you deliberately in order to find out your real opinion of Domleo." They seemed to turn away, for during some moments French could only hear the murmur of their voices. Then apparently they approached again. "I thought it was Charles he suspected," Mrs. Berlin was saying. "Then today I thought it was myself. He knows a lot, Jeff. He knows about Colonel Domleo's letter and the photograph." "Yes, but it's all immaterial. He doesn't know what really happened that night, and he won't know." "But if he arrests us?" "Let him. As far as I'm concerned, he can do nothing. He can't break down the evidence of all those people in Manchester with whom I spent the night of the murder. You, I admit, haven't such a watertight alibi, but it is impossible that he can prove you committed a crime of which you are absolutely innocent. And he can't connect you with Charles. Remember that we've no reason to suppose he has the least idea that Charles is alive." "If he finds that out, he'll suspect Charles, and then he'll suspect me as his accomplice." "I dare say," Pike admitted, "but he won't find out. Poor old Charles. I said to him on the last day—" The two moved off again, for Pike's voice died down into an unintelligible murmur. Again, for some moments, French could not distinguish what was said. Then the words came more clearly. "No," Pike was saying, "I have a better plan than that. Tomorrow I'll call at the yard to see French, and I'll confess to the murder. I'll say that my misery through remorse and suspense is worse than anything I could afterwards suffer, and that I just can't bear it any longer. Lots of murderers have done that, and he'll suspect nothing. He'll, of course, arrest me. Admittedly, he may arrest you also. This, of course, I should infinitely regret, but you will agree there is no other way. He'll then think he has solved his problem, and he'll look no further afield. Before going to the yard, I'll communicate with Charles, and Charles can make his getaway. Then, when Charles has had time to get out of the country, I shall produce my Manchester witnesses and prove my innocence. The case against you will then break down." "That's all right, except for two things," Mrs. Berlin returned. "If Charles believed he could get out of the country, he would have done it long ago. Secondly, why, if you prove your innocence, will the case against me break down?" "Those are easily answered. By the time Charles was well enough to travel, suspicion had been aroused, and every policeman in the country was on the lookout for the Ashburton murderer. If I confess, the watch at the ports will be relaxed. Besides—" Again the words became unintelligible. There was a faint sound of slowly pacing feet, and the voice dwindled. But after a short time the footsteps again grew louder. "Under the circumstances," Mrs. Berlin was saying. "But of course, if Charles is taken, we shall be accused of being his confederates." "Very possibly, but Phyllis, what can we do? We know old Charles is innocent, though things look so badly against him. We can't let him down. We must do what we can to help him and take the risk." I know, but isn't the whole thing just awful? What have we done that we should get into such a position? It's too much." Her voice, though carefully repressed, was full of suffering, and French could picture her wringing her hands and on the verge of tears. Pike comforted her, though not at all in the tone of a lover, then went on. "It's time that we went back, old girl. Until I get the warning to Charles, we mustn't risk being seen together. Therefore you'd better go on by yourself. I'll follow in 10 minutes. They bade each other an agitated farewell, and then Mrs. Berlin's light footsteps sounded on the path. For another quarter of an hour Pike remained among the trees, his presence revealed by occasional movements and by the whistling under his breath of a melancholy little tune. Then, at last, he also moved away, and French was able to stretch his aching limbs. Carefully he followed his man back to the tube station and eventually to his rooms in Keppel Street. He did not know what to make of the conversation to which he had just listened. The statements made were so surprising and unexpected that at first sight he was inclined to dismiss the whole thing as a blind, deliberately arranged to throw him off the scent. Then he saw that for several reasons this could not be true. In the first place, Phyllis and Pike did not know he was listening. In the second, such a plan would require careful prearrangement, and since his visit to Pike, the latter had had no opportunity of communicating with Phyllis Berlin. Then there would be no object in such a scheme. They surely did not imagine that because of it French would relax his watch on them. Moreover, if it were false, its falseness would be demonstrated on the very next day. No, French felt the interview must be genuine. And if so, what a completely new view it gave of the crime. Berlin, Phyllis, and Jefferson Pike, all apparently mixed up in the affair and all innocent. Who, then, could be guilty? French had to own himself completely puzzled. If this view were correct, the murderer must be someone whom he had not yet seriously considered. Unless it could be Domlio, after all. Nothing that the two had said directly precluded the possibility. Of course, in this case it was difficult to see why they should not denounce Domlio if it would free themselves and Berlin from suspicion. But then again, they might suspect Domlio, even perhaps be reasonably certain of his guilt, and yet unable to prove it. French continued to turn the matter over in his mind, and the more he did so, the more he leaned to the opinion that Domlio must be, after all, the murderer. All the arguments which had before led him to this conclusion recurred to him with redoubled force, and the difficulties in the theory seemed more and more easily surmountable. Domlio's motor drive on the night of the crime, his denial of the trip, the hiding of the clothes and duplicator parts in the well, his depressed and absorbed manner, these really were not accounted for by any theory other than that of the man's guilt, and Domlio might easily have invented the story of the photograph and produced the letter to account for his nocturnal excursion. Puzzled and worried, French began to believe that he was on the wrong track in London and that he must return to Devon and try once more to get the truth from Domlio. But he would not relax his watch on Mrs. Berlin and Pike. Pike he would himself shadow next day, so that if he communicated with Berlin, he, French, would learn the latter's whereabouts. He turned to the nearest telephone booth, and ringing up the yard, arranged for reliefs for himself and Sergeant Carter. Then, Sergeant Dean having taken over the watch in Keppel Street, he went home. Next morning he called at the yard for Carter, and about 9 o'clock the two men reached Keppel Street. "That'll do, Dean. You may get away," French greeted the night man. "Nothing stirred, I suppose?" "Nothing, sir. No one in or out the whole night." "Now, Carter," French went on, "it's your show mostly today. Pike knows me, and I'll have to keep in the background. You stay about here, and I'll get a taxi and wait round the corner. If I see your signal, I'll come along." Time soon began to drag for the watchers. Evidently their man was in no hurry. 10 o'clock came, then 11, then 11:30, and still he made no sign. French began to grow seriously uneasy. At last he could stand it no longer. He got out of his taxi and strolled up to Carter. "Go up to the door and ask for him, Carter. If he sees you, say I sent you to ask if he would call round at the yard any time this afternoon." Taking his subordinate's place, he watched him walk up to the door and knock. In a moment the door was opened, and Carter disappeared. For several minutes he remained inside, while French, growing more and more anxious every second, remained pacing impatiently up and down. Then Carter reappeared, and without any attempt at secrecy beckoned to French. "What is it?" the latter whispered sharply as he joined the sergeant on the doorstep. "Anything wrong?" "I'm afraid so, sir. We can't make him hear." French swore. A wave of misgiving swept over him. Why in heaven's name hadn't he arrested the man last night when he had the chance? He pushed into the house to meet an anxious-looking landlady in the hall. "I am Inspector French of Scotland Yard," he explained. "Where is Mr. Pike?" "Lawks," said the landlady, recognizing her former visitor. "Are you police? And I thinking you were a friend of Mr. Pike's all the time." "Yes, madam, I am a police officer, and I want to see Mr. Pike at once. Where is he?" The anxious look returned to the woman's face. "He's in his room," she explained. "But he's not had his breakfast, and he won't answer my knocking. He said last night that he had a chill and that he wouldn't get up this morning, and for me not to disturb him. But that's no reason why he shouldn't answer a knock." "Which is his room?" said French grimly. This should be a lesson to him to avoid his confounded trick of waiting till he was sure. If the man had slipped through his hands, any chance of that chief inspectorship was gone, if his job itself remained. They went to a first-floor room at the back of the house, and French knocked peremptorily. There was no reply. "Down with the door, Carter. Put your shoulder to it with me." Despite the protests of the landlady, both men threw themselves on the door. With a tearing sound, the screws of the keeper drew out and the door swung open. The room was empty. It was a large room, comfortable, furnished as a bed-sitting room. It was not disarranged in any way, but the lower sash of the window was fully up. French hurriedly crossed to it and looked out. It gave on the yard, and about 4 feet below the sill was the roof of a small shed. This shed ran along the side of the yard at right angles to the main house, its further gable being against the wall, between the yard and the lane which passed at the back of the houses. The roof of the shed formed a direct passage from the room to the lane. Though French had no doubt that Pike had escaped by this route, he dropped out of the window and crawled over the roof tiles, searching for traces. These he speedily discovered. Someone had passed a short time previously. His chagrin was too deep for words. Even the lurid phrase with which in times of stress he was wont to relieve his feelings now proved utterly inadequate. He was aghast at the extent to which he had been hoodwinked. for it was now evident that Pike had known he had been shadowed to Hampstead Heath, and that the whole conversation there had been designed to put him, French, off the track. Pike was a cleverer man than he had thought. It seemed scarcely possible that the interview had been prearranged, and yet French could not imagine its being an improvisation. The whole thing was very puzzling. However, at least one thing was clear. Jefferson Pike and Mrs. Berlin were the criminals for whom he was seeking, and he was on a hot scent. He would get Mrs. Berlin at once, and Pike with very little delay. The man had less than 12 hours' start. He turned to Carter. "Wait here for me, Carter," he directed. "Have a look round and learn anything you can, but without disturbing things. I shall be back presently." He ran out of the house and, calling up his taxi, was driven to Park Walk. There he soon spotted the man who was shadowing Mrs. Berlin. "Anything to report, Jeffries?" he demanded quickly. "She's still there all right?" "Still there, Mr. French. No one left the house since I came on duty." "Good. Then come with me." He rang at the door, and when the servant opened, asked for Mrs. Berlin. "She's not up, sir," the girl returned. "Last night she said she had a chill and did not want to be called or disturbed this morning. She said she probably wouldn't want anything until lunch and not to bring up breakfast, as she was going to take a sleeping draught and might not be awake." Though still inadequate to relieve his feelings, French swore his lurid oath. "Go and wake her now," he ordered the scandalized girl. "Here, I'll go to the door with you." The girl seemed about to object, but French's tone overawed her. Hesitatingly, she led the way. "Knock," said French. "Or wait, I will." He gave a rousing knock at the door. There was no answer. "She too, by thunder!" he growled, rattling the handle. The door was locked. "Your shoulder, Jeffries!" And for the second time in half an hour French burst open the door of a bedroom. As in the former case, the room was empty. But here there was no open window. Not only was the sash latched, but when French opened it and looked out, he found that it was 30 feet above the pavement, and that there was nothing to assist a descent. A glance at the door explained the mystery. The key was missing. Evidently the occupant had left the room by the door, locking it behind her and removing the key, and the maid was able to supply the further information required. The girl, on coming down that morning, had found the yard door unlocked. Though she thought she had fastened it on the previous evening, she had supposed she must have overlooked it. French hurried down the narrow yard to the door which led out on the passage behind the houses, only to find that here again the door was locked and the key missing. Again and again he cursed himself for having underestimated the ability of these two people. Had he had the slightest idea that they had followed his progress so minutely, he would have employed very different methods. Even if he had not arrested them, he would have seen to it that they did not escape. The shadowing he had adopted would have been effective under normal conditions, but not where the victims were alive to their danger and ready to make a desperate bid for safety. But French was too sensible to cry over spilt milk. He had blundered. Very well, it could not be helped. But what he had to do now was to retrieve his error at the earliest moment possible. How could he most quickly get on the track of these criminals? He returned to the house and made a rapid search for any clue that the lady might have left, but without result. Then, leaving Jeffries in charge, he drove back to Keppel Street. End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Sea Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Stephen Warner. The Bitterness of Death. "Any luck, Carter?" French asked quietly as he re-entered Pike's room. "No, sir. He's taken a suitcase with him, a brown leather one of medium size. I got the description from Mrs. Welsh. She says she noticed it here yesterday afternoon, and it's gone now. And he has taken all his outer clothes, his suits and overcoats and shoes, but most of his socks and underclothing are here in these drawers. I've been through everything, but I've not found anything useful." "Let's have a look." French hastily ran through the missing man's effects. "Most of this stuff is foreign," he observed as he glanced over the clothes. "You see the Argentine marking on the collar and shirts? No, I don't think there's much to help us there. No books or papers?" "None, sir, but there's a big heap of burnt paper in the grate." "So I saw. We'll go through it later on. Now, ask the landlady to come here. Just sit down, Mrs. Walsh, will you? I want to know if you can tell me anything to help me to find your lodger. I'm sorry to say he is wanted on a very serious charge. Murder, in fact. Therefore, you will understand how necessary it is that you should tell me all you know." Mrs. Welsh was thunderstruck, declaring again and again that she would not have believed it of so nice a gentleman. She was also terrified lest her room should suffer through the inevitable publicity, but she realized her duty and did her best to answer French's questions. For a long time he gained no useful information. Then at last an important point came out, though not in connection with his immediate objective. Having given up for the moment the question of Pike's destination, French was casting around to see if he could learn anything connecting him with the crime, when he chanced to ask, had Mr. Pike a typewriter? "Not lately he hadn't," Mrs. Welch answered, "but he did have one for a time. I don't know why he got it, for I never knew him to use it, but he had it there on the table for about 3 weeks. "Oh," said French, interested. "When was that?" "I couldn't say exactly. 3 months ago or more, I should think. But my daughter might remember. Vera is a typist, and she was interested in the machine more than what I was. I'll call her if you like. She is at home on holidays." Vera Welsh was the pretty girl with fair hair and blue eyes whom French had already seen. She smiled at him as she appeared in answer to her mother's call. "We were talking of Mr. Pike's typewriter," he explained. "Can you tell me what make it was?" "Yes, I noticed it when I was dusting the room. It was a Corona 4. "And when did he get it?" The girl hesitated. "Between 3 and 4 months ago," she said at last, with a reserve which aroused French's interest. "Between 3 and 4 months," he repeated. "How are you so sure of that? Was there anything to fix it in your mind?" There was, but for some time the girl would not give details. Then at last the cause came out. It seemed that on the day after Vera had first noticed the machine, she had had some extra typing to do in the office, which would have necessitated her working late. But on that day her mother had not been well, and she had particularly wanted to get home at her usual time. The thought of Mr. Pike's typewriter occurred to her, together with the fact that he had left that morning on one of his many visits to the country. She had thereupon decided to borrow the machine for the evening. She had brought her work home and had done it in his sitting room. She did not remember the actual day, but could find it from her records in the office. "Very wise, if you ask me," French said sympathetically. "And what was the nature of the work you did?" He found it hard to keep the eagerness out of his voice. "Just a copy of some tenders we had from America. I am in a hardware shop in Tottenham Court Road, and it was about American lawn-mowers and other gardening machines." "I understand. I suppose you don't know what the copies were required for?" Just for filing. The originals had to be sent away, and these were wanted for reference. French rose to his feet. Certainly, the luck was not entirely against him. Put your hat on, if you please, Miss Welsh, and come along with me to your office. I must see that copy. I can't tell you how much you have helped me by telling me of it. The girl at first demurred, as she feared her employer might have views of his own as to the taking of important papers home from the office. But French assured her that he would see she did not suffer for her action. In fact, before she knew what was happening to her, she was in a taxi on the way to the place. On reaching the senior partner's office, French was as good as his word. He explained the importance of his seeing the typescript and saying that Miss Welsh had risked her job in the interest of justice, begged that the matter might not be held against her. Mr. Cook shook his head over the incident, but admitting to French that the girl was satisfactory, he agreed to overlook it. Then he rang for the papers in question. 10 seconds with his lens was enough for French. Here at last was the proof he had been looking for. The typing was that of the notes to the Veda Works, to the Swansea Garage, and to the Magneto Company. "I'm pretty glad to get this paper, Mr. Cook," he declared. "Now do you think you could let me keep it? Miss Welsh could perhaps type another copy for you." Mr. Cook was obliging, and in 10 minutes the precious document was handed over. Stopping only to get the girl to certify on it that she had made it with Pike's machine, French hurried her away. "I'll drive you home, Miss Welsh," he said with his pleasant smile. "You have been of the greatest help. Now, I wonder if you could do something else for me?" And he began repeating the questions he had already put to her mother. Almost at once he got valuable information, though once again not on the matter immediately at issue. It appeared that on the previous afternoon Pike had called the girl into his room and asked her if she would do a small commission for him. It was to take a letter to a lady in Chelsea. It concerned, so he said, an appointment to dine that evening, so that she would see that it was urgent. The matter was private, and she was not to give the note to anyone but the lady herself, nor was she to mention it. To compensate her for her trouble, and to cover the cost of taxis and so on, he hoped she would accept a 10-shilling note. She had not thought this strange, as she knew him to be liberal in money matters. But she had wondered that a note about a dinner appointment should be so bulky. The envelope was foolscap size and must have contained at least a dozen sheets. She had taken it to the address it bore and handed it to the lady, Mrs. Berlin, at 70B Park Walk, Chelsea. She had not mentioned the matter to anyone. Here was the explanation of the conversation French had overheard on Hampstead Heath. With a little thought, he was able to follow the man's mental processes. In the first place, it was evident that Pike had realized that he was suspected, as well as that French had opened Gnop's note. He would guess, therefore, that French would shadow him continually until his meeting with Mrs. Berlin, and would try to overhear what passed thereat. He would also see, for that very reason, he was safe from arrest till the meeting had taken place, when this immunity would cease. But he wanted the night in which to escape. How could he stave off arrest until the following day? Clearly he had solved his problem by writing out the conversation, possibly with stage directions, as a playwright writes out the dialogue in his play. In it he had pledged himself to a visit to Berlin on the morrow. If he could make French swallow the yarn, he knew that arrest would be postponed in order that French might learn the junior partner's whereabouts. He had then sent Mrs. Berlin her lines, and she had learnt them like any other actress. French ruefully admitted to himself that in spite of the absence of a rehearsal, the two had presented their little piece with astonishing conviction. On reaching the yard, French's first care was to set the great machine of the CID in operation against the fugitives. Among his notes, he already had detailed descriptions of each, and he thought he would be safe in assuming that Pike would wear his collar up and his hat pulled low over his eyes. Mrs. Welch had described the suitcase, and burdened by this, French thought there was a reasonable chance of the man having been noticed. A number of helpers were soon busy telephoning the descriptions to all the London police stations, as well as to the ports. Copies were also sent for insertion in the next number of the Police Gazette. In a day or so, all the police and detectives in the country would be on the lookout for the couple. With Mrs. Welch's help, French made a list of the clothes likely to be in the suitcase. As these would have had a considerable weight, he thought it unlikely that Pike would have walked very far. He therefore dispatched 3 sets of men, one to make inquiries at the adjoining railways and tube stations, another to comb the neighboring hotels and boarding houses, and the third to search for a taxi driver who might have picked up such a fare in one of the nearby streets. It was not until these urgent matters had been dealt with that he turned to consider the second line of inquiry. Of Jefferson Pike himself, he knew practically nothing. What was the man's history? Why was he remaining in England? Particularly, where had he been at the time of the crime and while the crate was at Swansea? He began operations by writing to the Lincoln police for all available information about Phyllis Considine, as well as Stanley and Jefferson Pike. Then he sent a cable to the Argentine, asking the authorities there for details about Jefferson. He wired to the police at San Remo, Grasse, and in Paris, asking whether the cousins had stayed during the month of July at the various hotels Jefferson had mentioned. Lastly, he rang up the Bibby Line offices to know if they could help him to trace 2 passengers named Pike, who had sailed from Liverpool to Marseille on their Flintshire about 4 months previously. The Bibby people replied that the Flintshire had been home, but had left again for Rangoon. However, if Mr. French would call at their office, they would show him the passenger list and perhaps give him other required information. In an hour, French was seated with the manager. There he inspected the list, which bore the names of Stanley and Jefferson Pike, and he was assured that 2 gentlemen answering to those names had actually sailed. "If that is not sufficient for you, it happens that you can get further evidence," the manager went on. "Mr. Hawkins, the purser of the Flintshire, broke his arm on the homeward trip. He went on sick leave, and if you care to go down to Ramsgate, you can see him." "I shall be only too glad," French said. Armed with an introduction from the manager, French traveled down next morning to the Isle of Thanet. Mr. Hawkins was exceedingly polite and gave him all the information in his power. He remembered the Pikes having sailed on the last trip from Birkenhead to Marseille. Stanley Pike he had not come in contact with more than in the normal way of business, though they had once chatted for a few moments about the day's run. But he had seen a good deal of Jefferson. He, Mr. Hawkins, had spent a year in the Argentine in Jefferson's district, and they had found they had many acquaintances in common. He had formed a high opinion of Jefferson, both as a man of the world and as a rancher. Both the cousins had seemed in every way normal, and several of the passengers had expressed regret when the 2 left the ship at Marseille. On reaching London, French drove to the Houston. Showing his credentials, he asked whether 2 gentlemen, a Mr. Stanley and a Mr. Jefferson Pike, had stayed there for one night towards the end of the previous July. It was not to be expected that the reception clerk would remember either visitor, but she soon turned up the register. The names appeared on July 21st, both having been written by Stanley. "That's scarcely good enough for me," said French. "It doesn't prove that they were both here." "Practically, it does," the clerk returned. "You see, each was allotted a room. If the rooms had not been occupied, the allocation would have been cancelled, for at that time we were turning people away every night. But we can soon settle it." She looked up her account books. "Here," she went on after a moment, "are the accounts in question. Mr. Stanley occupied number 346 and Mr. Jefferson number 351. The accounts were paid separately. I receipted Mr. Stanley's, and Miss Hurst, another of our staff, receipted Mr. Jefferson's. Curiously," she went on, "I remember Mr. Stanley paying. He broke the basin in his room, and we had some discussion as to whether he would be charged for it. He was, in the end." This would have seemed ample confirmation of Jefferson's statement to most people, but French, with his passion for thoroughness, decided to see the chambermaid. She remembered the incident, and remembered also that the gentleman's friend had occupied number 351, as on her bringing his hot water and answering to his ring, he had said he was late and would she go and wake up his friend in number 351. She had done as requested, but the friend was already up. From the Houston, French walked to Kettle Street. Yes, Mr. Jefferson had taken the rooms on the 22nd July last, and though he had been frequently away for a day or two at a time, he had lived there ever since. Moreover, Mrs. Welsh's records enabled her to say that he had been absent not only on the night of the crime, but also on the date when the crate was disposed of at Swansea. On his return to the yard, French found that replies had come in from Paris and the Riviera. Stanley and Jefferson Pike had stayed at the 3 hotels in question. The next post brought a letter from the Lincoln police. It appeared that the 3 young people about whom inquiries had been made had lived in the district at the time mentioned. Mr. Considine was a well-known practitioner in the town until his death in 1912, but little was known of his daughter, Phyllis, save the mere fact of her existence. Stanley and Jefferson Pike had lived with a relative in the suburbs and had attended a private school kept by a Dr. Oates. The relations between the girl and the boys were not known, but it was probable that they had met, as they were in the same social set. More could probably be learned by further inquiries. This seemed to French sufficient to corroborate the statements of Jefferson Pike and Mrs. Berlin, and he advised the Lincoln police not to trouble further in the matter. He had scarcely written his note when a cable from the Argentine police was handed to him. Jefferson Pike was well known as the owner of an estancia in the Rosario district. He was believed to be comfortably off, though not wealthy. He answered the description given in the wire from Scotland Yard and had left for England on the boat mentioned. With the exception of the fact that Jefferson was away from his rooms at the time of the crime, all this was disappointing to French. So far he had learned little to help in the building up of his case. On the contrary, the tendency was in Jefferson Pike's favor. He did not appear to be of the stuff of which murderers are made, nor, from the purser's description, did it seem likely he was hatching a crime while on the Flintshire. On the other hand, there was no knowing what even the mildest man might do under the stress of passion. But what really worried French was the fact that he had made no progress toward the tracing of his suspect's present whereabouts. In vain he urged his men on to more intensive efforts. Nowhere could they learn anything to help. But he realized that there was nothing for it but patience. The business was necessarily slow, as it meant individual inquiries from everyone concerned. French did not dare to advertise, lest Pike should see the notice and take still further precautions against discovery. The third day passed, and the fourth, French growing more restless every hour. He now began to consider publicity, broadcast descriptions, advertisements in the papers, even the offer of a reward for secret information. Finally, he decided that if by the following evening no news had come in, he would put these agencies in operation. But the men of the CID are marvelously efficient and persistent. On returning from lunch on the fifth day, French learned to his infinite satisfaction that a taximan whose information might prove valuable had been found and was on his way to the yard. 10 minutes later, an intelligent-looking man in a driver's uniform was shown in. "Good afternoon," said French. "You have something to tell me? Just let me have your name and address, and then go ahead." William Service explained that he was the driver of a taxi in the employment of Metropolitan Transport Limited. On Monday night, the night in question, he had driven a fare to Euston for the 12:25 express. On leaving the station, he was returning through Russell Square to his garage when, near the end of Keppel Street, he was hailed by a man from the sidewalk. He had not wished to take another fare, but the man had offered him an extra 5 shillings to do so, and he had then agreed. The man was of medium height and build and dressed in a fawn coat and soft hat. Service could not describe his features, the brim of his hat being pulled low to meet his upturned collar. He was carrying a largish suitcase. He desired Service to drive to the Boltons, which, the inspector probably knew, was an oval with a church not far from Chelsea. The inspector knew it and recognized with delight that it was just beside Park Walk. There he was to pick up a lady and to drive them both to a house in Victory Place, not far from the Elephant and Castle. The lady had been waiting. As far as he could see, she answered the inspector's description. He had driven both parties to the address mentioned. It was a big house of working-class flats. "Good. You've told your story well," French approved. "Now I want you to drive me to the place. I shall be ready in a moment." The last lap! A kind of cold excitement took possession of French. It had been a long and troublesome case, but it was over now. Another fine feather in his cap, another step to that somewhat overdue chief inspectorship for which he had been so long hoping. A few minutes, an hour at most, and the thing would be an accomplished fact. Hastily calling his 2 assistants, Carter and Harvey, he set off with them for Victory Place. "It's a big thing, this," he explained. "There must be no mistake about it. If we let these people slip through our fingers, we needn't go back to the yard." They drove to the end of the block containing the house, and, Carter and Harvey remaining in the taxi, French went alone to reconnoiter. He rang at a door in the basement and asked the woman who opened it if she could direct him to the caretaker. "My husband's the caretaker, sir," she answered. "But he's out at present. Is it anything I can do?" "Probably you can," said French with his most winning smile. "I'm looking for the lady and gentleman who came in on last Monday night. They arrived by a late train and weren't here till after midnight." "Oh, yes, Mr. and Mrs. Perrin." "That's right. Which flat have they taken?" "Number 19. That's the top one on the right of the stairs." "Thank you. Do you know if they are in at present?"
"Mrs. Perrin is out. I saw her go about half an hour ago.
So far as I know, Mr. Perrin is in. Thanks. I'll just go up and see. French returned to the taxi. The woman is out, but Pike is supposed to be upstairs in number 19 flat. You, Harvey, will stay in the entrance hall and watch the stairs and lift. Take him without fail if we miss him above. If the woman appears, don't show up, but let her go in. Carter, you come upstairs with me. Harvey strolled to the door and became immersed in the list of the flat holders, while French and Carter began to climb the stairs. There were 2 flats on each story, to right and left of the flights. When they reached the first landing, French pointed to a fire escape notice. They followed the pointing hand to the back of the house along a passage between the 2 flats, and, silently pushing open a door, fitted with panic fastenings, saw an iron staircase leading down outside of the wall from the top story to a paved yard. You will have to stay and watch that, Carter. I can manage the blighter upstairs. For a moment, French wished he had brought another man. Then he thought of how many times he had carried out arrest single-handed. There was no difficulty. A whistle would bring his 2 men at top speed, and if by some incredibly unlikely accident he let Pike slip through his hands, one or other of them would certainly take him on his way down. He silently mounted the stairs to the 10th story. Number 19 was the top flat, but the stairs led on to a door on the roof. French knocked at number 19. There was no answer. In a moment he knocked again. Then, after waiting a few seconds, he turned the handle. The door was unlocked, and French pushed it open and looked in. Through a tiny hall he could see into a living room, small and poorly furnished, and with a kitchenette in the rear. Other partially open doors from the hall led into bedrooms. So far as he could see, the place was deserted. Softly closing the outer door, he passed into the living room, and standing in its center, looked around. Opposite him was the fireplace with a gas fire turned low. In the right wall was the window, and against the left stood a table with a chair at each end. 2 wicker armchairs were drawn up to the fireplace, and to the right of the door was a dresser containing crockery. Some books lay on the floor in a corner, but the center of the room was clear of furniture. French could see everything in the room with one exception. At the side of the fireplace was a closed cupboard. Possibly this might contain something useful. He had stepped across the room and put his hand on the cupboard doorknob when the feel of a presence, rather than an actual sound, caused him to swing suddenly round. A man had entered and was watching him. French stared in his turn. This was not Pike. This was a smaller man and hollow of cheek, dark in coloring, and with a pair of keen eyes uncovered by glasses. A friend of Pike's, no doubt. But this man was vaguely familiar. That he had seen him at no distant time, French felt certain. Then the man moved slightly, and French noticed the marks of pince-nez on his nose. As he did so, he remembered where he had seen, not him, but his photograph, and he stared spellbound in speechless amazement. For a moment, neither moved. Then French recovered himself. With a step forward, he cried, "Stanley Pike, I arrest you on a charge of—" He stopped. Had he gone mad? Wasn't the dead man Stanley Pike? How could he be charged with murdering himself? French felt his brain reel, but he grew more and more convinced that the man was indeed Stanley Pike. Therefore the victim must have been, of course, Berlin. How the whole thing had happened, French could not form an idea, but he saw that this could be straightened out later. For the moment his course was clear. He must arrest this man. Though these thoughts flashed through French's mind at lightning speed, in his extremity of surprise he remained for a moment speechless, his eyes fixed on the other's face. Then a slight movement of the man's right arm attracted his attention, and he glanced downward. Pike had taken an automatic pistol from his coat pocket and was holding it steadily, pointed at French's heart. "No, Mr. French," he said quietly. "I don't think so. You've not got me, but I've got you. Put up your hands." As he slowly obeyed, French saw that he was in imminent danger of his life. Pike's features were set in an expression of ruthless determination, and there was murder in his eyes. He went on speaking in quiet, grim tones. "It is true, I may not get away with it, but I'm going to have a try. You won't, anyway. I suppose you have men posted below?" "I've men coming up the stairs after me," French lied. "That's so. They're not hurrying. I shall have plenty of time before they get to the top. I'm going to shoot you now, Mr. Joseph French. The upper part of this building is deserted. No one across the way, and only a couple of old women on the floor below. The rest are all out at work. I shall be across the roof and down the next stairs before your men are halfway up these. I may carry it off and I may not, but I'll not be taken alive." "And Mrs. Berlin?" Pike's eyes flashed. "They'll not get her either. I know where she is, and I'll pick her up. Say your prayers, Mr. French. You've only got seconds to live." He slowly raised the pistol from the level of his side pocket to that of his eyes, keeping it first directed to French's heart and then to his head. In those few moments French tasted the bitterness of death. He knew instinctively that the man meant to carry out his threat, and he was powerless to prevent him. Covered by Pike's steady gaze as well as by his pistol, no sudden spring would help him. They were only about 5 feet apart, but the man would fire before he could reach across half the distance. Carter and Harvey were at the bottom of 100 feet of stairs. They wouldn't even hear the shot. A numbing fear crept into French's heart, while thoughts of his wife and visions of scenes in his past life floated before his mind's eye. And all the time he was desperately, despairingly racking his brains to find a way of escape. An instinctive urge that he must gain time at all costs took possession of him. Then, as he was trying to evolve some further bluff, an idea shot into his mind which suggested a glimmering of hope. It was a terribly faint glimmering. The chances were 1,000 to 1 against him, almost a forlorn hope, but it was all he could think of. Neither man had moved during the interview. French had swung round from the cupboard and was still facing the door through which the other had entered. Pike, on his part, had his back to the door and was facing the cupboard. French instantly began to act a part. First, he wished to show fear. Here he had not to act. The emotion was only too genuine. Indeed, had he let himself go, he would have been paralyzed with terror. Therefore, as he spoke, his eyes were agonized, his features distorted, and his voice thick and trembling. "Don't be a fool, Pike. You can do better than that. I've sense enough to know when I'm beaten. My life's of more value to me than success in a case. You want your liberty, and I want my life. I see a way in which we can each get what we want." Pike did not relax his attitude. "I believe you are a damned liar," he said, only with a stronger adjective. "However, shove ahead with your plan, and any tricks or movements and you're a dead man." "If you were once clear of me," French went on, evincing the most transparent evidences of terror, "you could walk out of the building past my men and they'd never suspect you. They're here to look for a quite different man, and the mere fact that you walked quietly downstairs after I had gone up to look for Jefferson would show that you were not the man I was after. That all right so far?" "Well?" French allowed his eyes to roam over the room, but without making any change in his expression. After the briefest pause, he went on. "No, to get away from me is the difficulty, for while I should be willing to give you my oath not to interfere, I don't suppose you would accept it. Well, this is my plan." Calling all his histrionic powers to his aid, French again glanced around the room, suddenly staying his gaze on the door. Then with the whole strength of his will he pretended to himself that he saw Carter entering. On this he fixed his mind, with the result that his eyes took on the appearance of definitely looking at something, while an expression of the utmost thankfulness and relief showed on his features. But he was quick to add the idea that Pike must not follow what was in his mind, and he at once looked away and back to Pike's face. With a fine effect of recovering a line of thought which had been disturbed, he continued, now trying to give the impression of faked fear. "I propose that I withdraw to the kitchenette and there gag myself and tie myself up to your satisfaction. You, of course, would keep me covered all the time, and it would be quite impossible for me to play you any trick. Or, if you preferred it, I could do the tying up in this room." Again he glanced at the door, as if he could not keep his eyes off it. This time he slowly shifted the point at which he was looking to just behind Pike, while he allowed relief and satisfaction to grow on his face. Once more he hurriedly withdrew his gaze and looked at Pike. "I noticed a clothesline in the kitchenette which would do," he went on, but now absent-mindedly and giving quick, as if involuntary glances behind Pike. "If you agree, I'll back in there and get it down. If I attempt to play you false, you can shoot." He paused, and looking directly behind Pike, allowed a slight, triumphant smile to appear on his lips. Pike had obviously followed the direction of his glances, and he had been getting more and more uneasy. At French's smile he could stand it no longer. For the 10th of a second he glanced behind him, and at that moment French, standing braced and ready, sprang. Like lightning he dropped his head while his left fist struck the other's right wrist upwards. Instantly Pike fired, and a hot iron seemed to sear the crown of French's head, but he was not disabled. Seizing Pike's right wrist with his left hand, he drove with his right for the man's chin. But Pike ducked, and he missed. Then the two men, clinching with their free hands, began a voiceless struggle for their lives. Pike's desperate efforts were to turn the pistol inwards, French's to prevent him. Locked together, they swayed backwards and forwards. Then French tripped over a chair, and they swung with a crash against a table. It gave way, and staggering across its wreckage, they fell. French found himself underneath and redoubled his efforts, but he was hampered by the blood from his wound, which ran down and blinded one of his eyes. Fortunately, he was the stronger man, and in spite of his handicap, slowly his strength and weight began to tell. Gradually he forced Pike's arm around until the other had to roll over on his back to save its dislocation. Both men were now gasping and sobbing from want of breath. But French, with a superhuman effort, dropped Pike's left arm and, seizing his collar, twisted it tight. Pike laid out with his free arm, but he was weakening, and French, spent and giddy, but thankful, felt he could hold on in spite of the blows, and that the affair was now only a matter of time. And then, lying grimly clinging to the choking man's collar, he felt a real thrill of delight as he saw the door slowly open, just as he had pictured it. Carter at last! It was over. But it was not Carter who appeared. There, gazing down on them, with amazement printed on her features, was Mrs. Berlin. It did not take her long to appreciate the situation, and with a muffled scream she threw herself on the heaving mass. "Give me the pistol, Stanley," she cried softly. "I'll settle him." But Pike was beyond coherent thought. Half insensible, he still kept his hand locked, and she could not release the fingers. French, seeing the end, put all his remaining strength into a shrill cry of "Help!" before he felt the woman's fingers tighten around his throat. Letting go of the now unconscious Pike, he tried desperately to loosen their clinging grip, but he was too weak. Choking, he struggled impotently while gradually it grew darker, and he sank slowly into a roaring abyss of nothingness. End of Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Sea Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Stephen Warner. Conclusion. When French struggled back into consciousness, he found himself lying on the floor of that upper room with Sergeant Carter bending solicitously over him. "He's coming to," he heard him say as if from a great distance. "He'll be none the worse in a few minutes." "I'm all right," French whispered faintly. "What about—" "Both safe as a house," Carter answered. "I thought you were taking too long over the job, and I was coming up the fire escape when I heard you shout. Lucky I got up in time, but it was a near thing, Mr. French. Just as near a thing as I should like to see. Don't you be in any hurry. You've all the day before you. Take a nip of this brandy that Harvey has brought." The stimulant made French once again feel his own man, and he sat up to find that his assailants had been safely handcuffed. Mrs. Berlin sat in one of the wicker armchairs, deadly pale and with an expression of murderous hate in her eyes. Pike was still unconscious, and the others at once turned their attention to him, with the result that presently he, too, revived. The taxi was waiting, and before many minutes had passed, both prisoners were lodged in the cells. When French sat down in his own room to think over this unexpected development, he very soon saw that he had made a terrible error in his handling of the case. Never before had he blundered so inexcusably. The clue to the truth was there in his hand, and he had missed it. Though, even now, he could not understand all that had happened, he saw enough to appreciate his mistake, to locate the point at which he had strayed from the right path. He had accepted the identification of the remains, but on whose testimony? On that of the criminals, Mrs. Berlin, and the man whom he had thought was Jefferson Pike. Of course, at the time at which he interviewed them, he had no idea of their connection with the crime, and therefore no reason to doubt their statements, but his error came in just here. That by the time he began to suspect them, the identification was so firmly fixed in his mind that he overlooked the fact that it depended on them. If he had remembered that supremely important point, he would have questioned the dead man's identity. This would have led him to investigate, even more closely than he had, the movements of the Pikes, and no doubt he would have thus discovered the impersonation which had been carried out. The first question, then, which demanded solution was, if the man whom he had thought was Jefferson Pike was really his cousin, where was Jefferson himself? Like a man in a dream, French went back to Keppel Street. Was Mrs. Welsh absolutely sure that Mr. Pike, who had engaged her rooms on the 22nd of July, was the same man who had occupied them ever since? Mrs. Welsh, when at last she had been made to understand the question, was absolutely sure. If she were right, Stanley's impersonation of Jefferson must have begun on the 22nd of July. They had both been at the Houston in the morning. By the evening, Jefferson, the real Jefferson, apparently had vanished. Then suddenly French remembered the episode of the broken basin. It had not occurred to him before, but now he wondered if there was not more here than met the eye. The accident was unlikely. Had the basin been deliberately broken to help on some trick? He went back to the Houston and once again interviewed the reception clerk, but she could add nothing to her former statement. Then he re-examined the chambermaid. From her, at last he obtained a new fact, an apparently trifling fact, but what a difference it made in his conclusion. The girl had stated that the gentleman who broke the basin had told her that he had overslept himself and had asked her to see that his friend in number 351 was awake. She had gone and found that the friend was already up. Now French learned that by up, she meant that the man was up and dressed and had left his room. At this, a light shone into French's mind. He retired to a corner of the smoking room, and after half an hour's hard thinking, he reached a detailed solution. He saw that it would be possible for Stanley to arrive at the hotel and engage 2 rooms, ostensibly for himself and his cousin. He would go to his own room, after explaining that his cousin would arrive later in the day. After impressing his personality on the staff, he would go out, make up as Jefferson, return with more luggage, and occupy the second room which had been engaged. He would sleep in Jefferson's room, and in the morning ring early for shaving water, get up, dress, take his luggage down, pay his bill, and leave the hotel. Then, hurrying back, he would slip into his own room, unobserved, go to bed, and ring again for hot water, giving the maid the message about his friend. Lest the incident should be forgotten in the event of future inquiries, he would smash the basin, thus impressing his identity on all concerned. This is what Stanley had done, French was now pretty sure, and he dispatched wires to the French and Italian police asking if the same trick had been carried out in Paris and at Grasse and San Remo. After some time there were replies. It had been carried out in Paris, but not at the other 2 places. At the latter there was no doubt that both men had been present. Jefferson Pike had, therefore, disappeared at some point between Grasse and Paris, and French soon saw that there was nothing for it but to go to the Riviera and himself inquire into the men's movements. Accordingly, after consultation with his chief, he obtained a letter to the French police, and traveling to Marseille, began work. Slowly and painfully he traced the 2 from Marseille to San Remo, to Monte Carlo, to Grasse, and finally to Nice. And there, in the pleasure city, on the shores of the Mediterranean, he came on the explanation he sought. For at Nice, Jefferson Pike had died. At first, knowing what he did, French had suspected foul play. But in this he found he was mistaken. Jefferson had taken ill at his hotel and had at once been moved to a hospital. There he had been operated on for appendicitis. French saw the doctor who had had charge of the case and learned the details. There had been complications, and the operation could not save him. French was deeply chagrined at his failure to learn so essential a fact at an earlier stage in his investigation. He swore great oaths to his gods that never, never again should he fail to follow up to the very end every clue which presented itself, whether he thought it likely to prove valuable or not. With identity of murderer and victim established, a comparatively short further inquiry sufficed to clear up the details of the affair which were still in doubt, and dreadful reading they made. It seemed that soon after Phyllis Considine came to Ashburton as the bride of Charles Berlin, she found she had made a terrible mistake in her marriage. The feeling which she had imagined was love died away, and she saw herself tied for life to a man whom she disliked. A mutual coldness inevitably resulted, which rapidly widened as the husband also found himself disillusioned. On Phyllis's side, less than a year sufficed to turn it into a bitter hatred. Under these miserable circumstances, she began to look elsewhere for companionship, and Stanley Pike, who found himself strongly attracted to his former playmate, was only too ready to fill the breach. They saw a good deal of each other, and the inevitable happened. Before long, both were deeply in love. Though they were careful to act discreetly when under observation, they were not careful enough, and Berlin became aware of what was going on. He at once remonstrated with his wife, finally telling her in no ambiguous terms that if given cause he would not hesitate to divorce her. If this had been all, Phyllis would no doubt have eagerly seized so complete a solution of her difficulty, but both she and Pike saw that it was by no means all. Berlin, as joint owner of the business, would certainly have dismissed Pike as well as cut Phyllis out of his will. The couple would, therefore, have been without money or prospects. This she was not prepared for, and while admitting unwise behavior, she denied that there was anything serious in her relations with Pike, and undertook that Berlin should have no further cause of complaint. Then she began to meet Pike secretly, and gradually the terrible solution which they afterwards adopted grew subconsciously in both of their minds. If Berlin should die, the whole situation would be straightened out. From that time, the idea of murder was never far from the thoughts of either, but they could see no way in which the dreadful deed could be safely accomplished. Pike, however, was sufficiently callous and far-seeing to suggest the flirtation with Domlio, partly as proof that the lady's feeling for himself was a thing of the past, and partly lest a scapegoat should afterwards be wanted in connection with the murder. Then came Jefferson's visit, and the cousins' holiday, and Jefferson's unexpected death. Pike was about to give up the tour and come home, when it suddenly struck him that here was the solution for which he and Phyllis had been looking. He traveled up to Paris, and there spent a few days in working out his plan. The idea of diverting suspicion from the murder of Berlin by staging the accident on the moor had already occurred to him, but this plan had the objection that it involved his own disappearance as well as Berlin's. If, however, he disappeared, the whole fruits of the murder would be lost, as he was committing it simply to enable him to marry Phyllis. Jefferson's death showed him how he might escape this dilemma. He would, in brief, murder Berlin, stage the accident on the moor, and disappear as Stanley Pike. He would immediately reappear as Jefferson. By impersonating Jefferson, he could marry Phyllis and get all his cousin's money as well. In this scheme there was a risk, of course, but the chances of anyone learning of Jefferson's death were, he thought, sufficiently remote to make the scheme practicable. As soon as he could, without suspicion, he would go abroad, where Phyllis could presently follow him. At first, the plan seemed full of snags, but as he thought it over, he saw ways of overcoming one difficulty after another, until the whole ghastly affair grew coherent and feasible. When he returned to Ashburton, the scheme was cut and dry, and he had only to get Phyllis's approval and promise of help. Jefferson, the real Jefferson, had already visited Ashburton, but he had only been seen closely by the landlady, Mrs. Billing, the Berlins, and their servants, Domleo, and one or two others. Of these, the only one Stanley need interview was Mrs. Billing, and he felt sure he could deceive her. Sergeant Daw, with whom in his inquiries about the tragedy he would have most to do, had only seen Jefferson in the distance. Personation would, therefore, be possible. The first thing necessary was to prove Jefferson still alive. Stanley found it easier than he had expected. From a theatrical supplies shop he bought shoes with false internal heels to increase his height, padded underclothes to give him the necessary girth, rubber discs to wear inside his cheeks to alter the shape of his face, and glasses. When, in addition to those, he wore Jefferson's clothes and copied as best he could Jefferson's walk, speech, and deportment, it was not surprising that the unsuspecting and unobservant persons at Ashburton should be taken in. On his way home he carried out the tricks at the hotels, then taking the room in Keppel Street. For some hectic weeks he managed to live at Keppel Street as Jefferson and at Ashburton as Stanley. His continual absences from Ashburton, traveling for his firm, enabled him to put in the necessary appearances in Keppel Street, where he gave out that in intervals he was making business trips in England and France. He saw that by a judicious interview with the clerk at Tavistock Urban District Council he could arrange for the evening journey across the moor. His first idea had been to dispose of Berlin's body on the way back by throwing it into one of the small mires close to the road. But when he considered this in detail, he realized that the difficulties were overwhelming, just as had been suggested to French by Sergeant Daw. He therefore devised the episode of the duplicator in order to provide a means for the removal of the remains. He knew the Bury Inlet, and the date of a suitable tide became the foundation on which the rest of the plan was built. In London, he bought the second-hand typewriter and wrote the letters ordering the duplicator and crane lorry on paper he had obtained from the LMS hotels. These letters he handed to the tobacconist, Gnop, who, for a consideration, undertook to post them on the proper dates. Neither he nor Phyllis was, therefore, in London when they were sent out, though he called in person at the hotels for the replies. He similarly obtained the duplicate magneto. This he handed to Phyllis, and she damaged it and ran it on the car until it gave up, then replacing the original. On the fatal night, every movement of each conspirator was carefully timed and cut and dried to the last detail. When near the works on the return journey, Stanley called out to Berlin to stop, saying that he had seen a man lying on the road. He jumped out and ran round the car, and on Berlin following him, he slipped behind his victim and sandbagged him. Hastily throwing the body into the car, he drove to the works gate. There he was met by Phyllis, who had already drugged Gurney's tea in the way French had surmised. At the works, Phyllis helped Pike to carry the body to the packing shed. After replacing Gurney's drugged tea with fresh, she put her bicycle in the tonneau of the car and drove out to the selected spot on the moor. She changed the magneto and made the 2 lines of footmarks by putting on shoes of Berlin's which she had brought for the purpose. Then, mounting her bicycle, she returned to the works. The bicycle and the magneto she hid in a clump of shrubs, waiting until Pike came out to say that the ghastly job in the works was complete. She then went home, silently letting herself in, replaced Berlin's shoes in his room, changed her clothes, wakened the maid, and called up Sergeant Daw. In the meantime, Stanley Pike rode on the bicycle to Colonel Domleo's, dropped the clothes and other objects into the well, and continued on his way to Plymouth. There he left the bicycle in a dark entry in the lower part of the town, where he was sure it would speedily be found and annexed. He took the first train to London, returning to Ashburton in the character of Jefferson on receipt of Dawes' wire about the tragedy. Such was the plan, and, had the conspirators been sure their actions would have remained unquestioned, they would have stopped there. But both were afraid that in some unforeseen way suspicion might be aroused, and they took several other steps in the hope of turning such possible suspicions on to other persons. First, they considered it necessary that, should the crate be discovered, the body therein should be taken as Stanley Pike's. This would effectually prevent a doubt arising as to Jefferson's identity. Pike, therefore, changed his own underclothes with those of the dead man, and dropped his own suit down the well, while both he and Phyllis stated that the birthmark on Berlin's arm was really on Pike's. To carry on the same deception, Pike decided to make up as Berlin while disposing of the crate. In height and build he was, in his disguise, not unlike Berlin. The chief difference between them was their coloring. Both the Pikes had dark, and Berlin fair. Stanley therefore dyed his hair and lightened his complexion before going to Wales. The episode of the blackmailing letter was designed with a similar object. Phyllis Berlin had staged the farce of the twisted ankle. She had fallen into Domleo's arms in such a way that a photograph might have really been a profitable investment to a blackmailer. Pike had, of course, forged the letter. The Confederates hoped that the taking out of the car which they believed would result, together with the finding of the articles in the well, which they thought a competent detective might achieve, would throw the suspicion on Domleo. With regard to money, Pike had resolved on a bold stroke. French found that he had instructed a firm of solicitors in London to get in touch with Jefferson's lawyers in the Argentine for the purpose of arranging the sale of Jefferson's property there. He had forged Jefferson's signature to the necessary documents, and the matter was well advanced. This piece of greed had prevented Stanley from leaving London, and had caused him to rent the Victory Place flat as a refuge in case Keppel Street got too hot to hold him. Flight thither under circumstances had been decided on, and, therefore, when danger threatened, only the time and method of reaching it remained to be settled. As all Berlin's property went to Phyllis under the deceased's will, she also would have been well off, so that when the two took up their abode in a rather out-of-the-way part of Algeria, as they had intended, they would have been comparatively rich. But thanks to Evan Morgan's desire for a fishing expedition on the last day of his holidays, together with Inspector French's steady pegging away at a puzzling and wearisome case, these evil hopes were frustrated. Some 3 weeks after the next assizes, both Stanley Pike and Phyllis Berlin paid for their crime with their lives, leaving the ownership of Jefferson's money as a juicy morsel on which the lawyers of England and the Argentine could pile up fees to their heart's content. For French, the case had not been an unmixed triumph, though in the end he had taken the criminals and added to his reputation with his superiors. In his heart of hearts he knew that he had been saved by the skin of his teeth alone, and that he had had a lesson in the danger of neglecting to follow up unlikely clues to the very end, which would last him for his life. But on the whole, he was satisfied. The End. End of Chapter 20. End of The Sea Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts.